Hello, AP Environmental Science students. Glad to see you again. Welcome back. Let's dig into some apes. So my name is Dr. Sowell and I teach apes down here in Jacksonville, Florida. So just as a quick reminder, remember this is when our exam is May 18th, and there are the times there on the left-hand side. And here are two questions: what percentage they're worth for the exam, and then 1 and 2 down here give you the description of the skills and the practices you'll need for those two questions. So let's do our little warm up. And this is the homework assignment from Miss Fassler's last video lesson on biogeochemical cycles, in particular the carbon cycle. So that there's an introduction paragraph up here, and then it says, scientists are interested in researching how increasing soil temperatures will affect the rate at which soil microbes decompose organic matter. They designed a laboratory experiment in which they measure the change in the amount of CO2 in soils incubated at different temperatures for a period of 5 days. All soils were collected from the same location. So the first question you were asked is to explain how carbon enters the soil. So here you could have said something like the carbon enters the soil from organic matter from dead plants and animals, and then the carbon enters the soil when they die. How does that carbon get back into the atmosphere was B, and that's through the decomposers. Carbon in the soil is returned to the atmosphere as CO2 when the decomposers in the soil break down dead plants and animals. And then through their cellular respiration, CO2 pops back in the atmosphere. So C and D were about the experiment itself. And this is definitely going to be a part, or a version, or something like this is going to be a part of FRQ number 1, experimental design. So identify the independent variable. The independent variable was the temperature. That was the thing that was changed by the scientist. What was the control? Remember, the control is the group that is not exposed to whatever variable you're exposing them to. In this case, it was the temperature. So the experimental control is the soil sample that is not incubated and left at room temperature. And then there's a describe question. How would the CO2 change if the temperature was increased to the point that it killed the soil microbes? Well, there would be less CO2 generated for the atmosphere because the decomposition would come to a halt with no decomposers. So hopefully you got some of those right, and that was a good review of Miss Fassler's talk on biogeochemical cycles. And again, this pattern will repeat. I'll leave you today with an FRQ or part of an FRQ to do, and Miss Fassler will go over that next time. All right, so here's where we're going today. We've got the biomes. Now, I'll go ahead and say up front, the biomes, there is a risk sometimes when you learn biomes that it's just a list. Here's a biome, 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 and it all kind of gets confusing in your head. So it's best if you can find ways to group them or compare them or contrast them. So I'll try to do some of that today, but I am going to have to resort at some point, you'll see, to kind of a list format, but I'll try whenever I can to make it a little bit more connected and robust and big picture as opposed to just a laundry list of biomes. And then particularly, we're going to focus on practice number 1, concept explanation. This is your ability to explain environmental concepts in contexts. All right, so we'll come back to this practice toward the end. So what do you need to know? So this is Unit 1, Topic 2, and Topic 3. So Topic 2 is the terrestrial, Topic 3 is the aquatic or the marine. No, actually, all the aquatic, marine and freshwater. So by the end of this section, you should be able to describe the global distribution and principal environmental aspects of terrestrial biomes. So distribution, where are they? There's a pattern to that. And then once you know kind of where they are geographically, what are some of their characteristics? What makes a savanna different from a tropical rainforest, for example? So to get there, we will describe the 9 major biomes that are terrestrial. And then for each of those 9, we're going to talk about climate, the organisms there, the distribution of resources, and look at some impacts, including climate change, on each one of those biomes. So let's first of all define what a biome is. So a biome is an area of the planet that can be classified according to its climate and the organisms that have adapted to that particular location and climate. So just as a quick review, remember, we might look at this grassland here and notice an individual species of grass. So this one organism right here, this grass, and all the grass of that species are a population. all of the different populations, the populations of insects, of birds, of small mammals, whatever it might be, all of those populations put together is the community. Add in all the abiotic factors of light and heat and lithosphere, that's the ecosystem. Well, biome, and this goes from kind of small to large, obviously. Biomes are even bigger than that. In fact, biomes could contain multiple ecosystems. And they're just not clearly defined. It's not like North America is this biome or Georgia is this biome. There are some fuzzy areas, some fuzzy transition zones. And then when you start learning about, or not learning, reviewing your biomes, and you've probably recognized this before, if you start to Google some of the biomes, some places call the same biome by a slightly different name. So you've got to be careful of the which classification system you're looking at. We use one that has 9 and they have certain names to them. So if we just start from a big picture, let's just look at the map of the world. Even if we don't label the biomes, you should start to see some patterns, even if we just look at colors. My eye is always drawn here to South America, to this tropical rainforest, and you can see this green is repeated several other places in this tropical equatorial region here. And then we could also go up to the very top and look at this light blue, which is the tundra, and that has a similar pattern of latitude. So one of the guiding principles of biomes is noticing where in terms of latitude they're located. So here are our 9 biomes that we must learn. So first of all, we've got the taiga. Now, I put boreal forest next to there because those 2 words are interchangeable. Sometimes you'll see it described as taiga. Sometimes you'll see it described as boreal forest. You should know both of those. Our particular curriculum uses the word taiga, but as you're studying and looking at other resources, boreal might pop up. Then we have temperate rainforest, temperate seasonal forests, and tropical rainforest. These first 4 are grouped together because they're all forests, and we're going to walk through each 4 of these so you can see similarities and differences. And then we move into shrubland, which is not dominated by trees, more of shrubs. And you'll notice in parentheses it says chaparral. Chaparral is what the shrubland is called in California. And so sometimes this word chaparral is used as a replacement for shrubland. Then we're going to do our 2 grasslands, the temperate grassland and the savanna. And then we'll do our 2 deserts, the hot desert and tundra, which is pretty much a cold desert. So that's the pattern we're going to go through today. So just as a quick reminder, I'm sure this is a review for you, but remember when we're talking about the tropical region, we're talking about that area above and below the equator. And then the areas above and below that are temperate, because the words temperate and tropical pop up in the names of those terrestrial biomes. So it's just a nice reminder of what those words mean. So again, here's our equator, area above and below that is tropical, and above and below that is temperate. All right, so throughout today, I'll be showing you different climate graphs from different biomes. Now, sometimes you'll see these called climatograms or climatographs, but all they are a visual representation of the climate of a biome. So let's just kind of deconstruct the graph here for a minute. The first thing I want to point out is the x-axis is the months. So this is a calendar year. So each of these bars is happening on a month. Then these bars represent precipitation. Precipitation is over here on the left-hand side, y-axis. And then on the right-hand side, we have temperature. So precipitation in the bars, temperature above. Now, if we just look at this biome, you may want to think, well, this is pretty warm. You know, this is a constant warm temperature. We don't see a big seasonal fluctuation, so it's hot pretty much most of the time, and a lot of rain. Well, it's a tropical rainforest. So that's what you should be able to do. Look at climate and precipitation and temperature and try to understand the connection to the specific biome. All right, a lot of the images and climatographs I'm going to grab today come from a really great resource from HHMI Biointeractive called Biome Viewer. It is free, it is really dynamic, and it's a great place to review all these biomes. So instead of going to the website, what I did is I just videotaped myself on the screen using Biome Viewer. So if it'll load up here, let's see if it's going to load. If not, I'll come back to it. Yeah, we'll just come back to it. But it's a nice little video to talk about Oh, here it is. So you'll notice here, it first starts out with just the terrain. So this upper left-hand side, it says terrain, and you can grab onto the globe and actually spin it around and move it to different locations. You can also flatten it out so it looks like a flat map, but it's also kind of fun to spin the globe, and you can zoom in and zoom out. But I first wanted to just put it onto terrain. Well, if you go over to that top left section, you can actually toggle it over to where it says precipitation. And you can go through and change the months and see how the precipitation, in this case over the continent of Africa, changes over the course of the year. That's just kind of interesting to look at. And you can switch it again at the top left to temperature and do the same thing. Look at how temperature changes over the course of a year in one particular location. And since biomes are really defined by their temperature and precipitation, next one to look at is biomes. So all the biomes are listed on the left. And all you have to do is go to a place on the map, click it, and it'll put a little pin in it. And in the top right, it'll bring up a climatogram. And that'll tell you obviously the temperature and precipitation. But if you click on more, it'll blow that up so you can see it really in detail. On the left-hand side, you'll also be able to click onto a description of the biome. So in this case, a savanna kind of gives you a description of where it's found, what it looks like. And on the right-hand side, you can click and look at some typical wildlife. In particular, it shows you the species richness for reptiles, amphibians, and mammals. And you can also toggle on and off levels of threatened or endangered or critically endangered. So it gives you more than just the climate and precipitation. It gives you wildlife as well. The last little feature I want to show you is the compare button. So you can pin one place and then click on the word compare and then click on another place. And what that'll do, it'll open up both of the views of the climatogram and you can compare them side by side. So for example, this is the temperate grassland in Russia on the left and the tropical rainforest on the right, and you can compare those two. So that's what Biome Viewer does. I highly recommend it. Great way to review. All right, let's keep trucking here. So first one I want to look at is the taiga. So again, located between 50 and 60 degrees. This is also known as the boreal forest. Low precipitation, low species diversity, low temperatures, some permafrost, not a lot, it's patchy. And interestingly enough, there's none in the southern hemisphere. This is all northern hemisphere. So if you'll notice on the biome viewer, it's called boreal forest, not taiga, but you can see it's this dark green in North America and over here in Asia and Europe, dark green. So let's look at two of the climatographs. So this is from Canada on the left and Russia on the right. Very far away from each other, but their climatograms look pretty similar. We have a seasonal fluctuation in temperature, pretty cold though, and pretty low precipitation. In terms of species richness, it's pretty low. Like I said, the biodiversity of organisms is pretty low. It's dominated by trees. Now, what kind of trees is unique? It's typically conifers, evergreen conifers, things like spruce and fir. And they've got those little needles instead of broad leaves. And those needles are very well adapted to drought conditions because there's not a lot of precipitation here. The organisms here, the actual animals, are medium to small size, some large ones, but no matter what, you've got to be adapted for the cold. So you're going to have insulating feathers or fur, or maybe even some long distance migrations to leave the boreal forest when it gets too cold. In terms of human impacts, there's really not a big threat from agriculture because the soil quality is pretty low. It's really cold. It's got a short growing season. There's not a lot of decomposition going on in the soil, so you don't get that really rich A-horizon humus nutrient layer that we would get elsewhere. But what it does do is it grows big trees, very slowly though, and it's a great source of lumber and pulpwood, huge source for industrial wood. So clearly the biggest anthropogenic threat is logging. There is some mining for natural gas and oil, and clearly climate change can affect this biome. As the planet warms and the climate changes, it may shift where these biomes are located. So this is just a really beautiful picture. That's the only reason I put it up here. It's a picture of a lynx, and this lynx is living in the boreal forest, again, also known as taiga. And if we zoom in on its face, you can see its beautiful eye. So this is the eye of the taiga. All right, let's get going. Let's do temperate rainforest. So temperate rainforest is located here in the Pacific Northwest, also in Europe and some in Asia as well. You'll notice that in Biome Viewer, it's called temperate coniferous forest. Coniferous just means conifer trees, evergreen trees. It's got warm summers and cool winters and some pretty adequate rainfall. So you can see that this on the left is from Japan and on the right is from Germany, both temperate rainforests, both pretty similar in precipitation and temperature. And if we compare species richness, it's much more species rich and biodiverse than the boreal forest was. It's again dominated by evergreen trees, these conifers, but also lots of lichen and mosses and ferns, these epiphytic plants. And then typical animals would be deer, elk, plenty of reptiles and amphibians. So in terms of the threats to the temperate rainforests, again, not a lot of soil fertility in terms of decomposition of the leaf litter because of those needles. So agriculture isn't a huge threat. What is a threat, again, is logging, because we've got some very large trees that grow here. And so this is especially important during our look at old growth forest. Remember, old growth forests are forests that have never been logged. And over here on the right-hand side, you'll see a picture of the northern spotted owl. We're not going to go into that today, but I would highly suggest if you're interested in learning about a great situation that explores the Endangered Species Act and really the politics and the economics of environmental legislation, that's a great case study to read about, the northern spotted owl in the old growth forest of the Pacific Northwest. Really interesting. All right, let's do temperate seasonal. This is our third forest. So we did boreal forest up here, the taiga. We did this coniferous forest, the tropical or the temperate rainforest below that. Now we're going to go into temperate seasonal. Seasonal is another word. Well, you know what seasonal means, but it also can be called temperate deciduous, meaning that the leaves are going to drop every year. So we can see a good chunk of this in the eastern part of the United States, over here in Asia, and also on the eastern coast of Australia. Now, this climatograph on the left is from Raccoon, Kentucky, and on the right is from somewhere in New South Wales in Australia. They are both temperate seasonal forests, but you'll notice while the precipitation is pretty the same, the temperature is quite opposite from each other, and clearly because this is in the southern hemisphere. In terms of species richness, it's got pretty strong species richness, much more than like a boreal forest or a tundra. Common animals are deer, bears, lots of small mammals and birds. But again, it's dominated by deciduous trees, trees that drop their leaves every year. In terms of human impact, because of that dropping of all the leaves and because of the warmer temperatures, we get that really strong buildup of organic material in the soil. So that leaf litter in the O horizon really decomposes down into that rich humus of the A horizon. And so therefore agriculture is probably more of a threat here, as well as logging and just urbanization, growth of cities. All right, let's look at our last forest, the tropical rainforest. This is the one that we're very familiar with in terms of the Amazon rainforest, but it's also located here in Africa and down here in Southeast Asia as well. And you probably could recognize this climatograph at this point. So very high temperatures, very high rainfall, very characteristic of a tropical rainforest. Really biodiverse area, huge species richness, lots of NPP. So remember, the NPP is the net primary productivity, the battery that kind of feeds the rest of the food web. There's so much vegetation that the rate of photosynthesis is so strong that it has lots of NPP to support a very complex food web in the tropical rainforest. Heavy canopy, and so meaning like heavy tree layers at the top. And so because of that, the plants there have learned to compete for the sunlight. So sunlight is a limiting factor for some of those plants, especially the ones growing underneath the canopy. But 2/3 of the terrestrial species on the planet are in this biome. Wow, that's a cool statistic. In terms of threats, clearly there's high decomposition here. So you would think that the soil would be very fertile, but actually it's quite the opposite. There's tons of leaf litter, tons of decomposition. So you would think that it would build up and create really fertile soil. But in fact, there's so much living vegetation that as soon as things decompose, those nutrients are assimilated right back up into the plant. So it doesn't have that buildup of nutrients that you might find in a grassland, for example. So again, agriculture, logging, human population growth, the typical suspects here. All right, so those are our 4 forests. Now we're going to go into this weird middle place, the shrubland, also called the chaparral. It's a pretty rare biome. It's typically in these coastal regions along California on the west coast of the United States, all around the Mediterranean, and there's some here in Australia. You'll notice that it's got hot, dry summers and cool, moist winters. That hot, dry summer is going to become important when we talk about the fires there. So you can notice here on its climatogram, temperature and precipitation with those hot, dry summers there in the middle. So here's some pictures of some chaparral shrubland in California. So again, mild winters with high precipitation and dry, hot summers. So that results in pretty not so fertile soil because of heavy leaching by those winter rains. But because of this dry, hot summer, it's very prone to fires, natural fires. So that is a characteristic of shrubland that is pretty unique. Therefore, the shrubs, the vegetation there, have adapted to this dry and fiery conditions. Typical organisms might be deer, lizards, jackrabbit, and then in terms of threats, human development and livestock grazing. All right, so now we're going to go into our 2 grasslands, temperate grasslands and savanna. So we're going to kind of squish them together in our talk. So temperate grassland, known primarily as prairie, pampas, veld, or steppe. This biome is largely devoid of trees and has large seasonal variability in temperatures, but relatively low precipitation. So grassy, very grassy. And then we have the savanna. With warm temperatures and seasonal rainfall, this biome consists of a mixture of grasses and sparse trees and is found within tropical or subtropical latitudes. So we have a grassland in the temperate region here, and then we have a grassland called the savanna in more tropical and subtropical regions here. So similar characteristics, but different locations. And we can see there are 2 climatograms here. So this is the temperate grassland, you can see there. And this is the African savanna, and you can see that. So we see much more of a seasonal rainfall event here in the savanna. All right, desert and tundra. Both are really deserts, one's hot and one cold. So a desert, we all kind of know what a desert is. So extreme cold temperatures, very treeless landscape. And then tundra, it's the same thing, just cold. So desert, hot and dry, tundra, cold and dry. And so you can see desert here, tundra up north. So both deserts, just differences in temperature. Again, you can see the 2 climatograms. So the desert, high temperature, tundra, low temperature, but both very minimal precipitation. I just wanted to pause really quick and talk one more thing about the tundra. Incredibly low productivity, low NPP, low species richness. And one of the things that connects to is ecosystem stability. We know that typically ecosystems with large species richness and wide biodiversity are more resistant and resilient in terms of their reaction to disturbances. So in a place like a tundra, that's just the opposite. So disturbances can have a much more long-lasting and dramatic effect because there's such slow growth and low biodiversity, it takes a long time to come back. So things like oil and natural gas exploration could be pretty impactful. And the next thing I want to show you is this picture down here. This is permafrost, that's permanently frozen ground. And this permafrost locks in a lot of organic material. Unfortunately, because of climate change and global warming, we're seeing the melting of permafrost. What happens when that permafrost melts? Decomposition, which was before stopped because it was frozen. Now the decomposition starts again. That puts more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which in turn causes a stronger greenhouse effect, which melts more permafrost, which puts more greenhouse gas. So that's that positive feedback loop that we've mentioned a few times. Positive feedback loop, good example of that. All right, so the way I want to end with the terrestrial biomes is show you this diagram, which I absolutely love because it's a different visual way to represent the different biomes. So you can see on the x-axis down here is temperature and the y-axis up here is precipitation. So down here at the corner, desert, this is hot, very hot, and very dry, low precipitation. Now, if we go to the highest amount of precipitation, tropical rainforest, so this is hot and wet. And if we go all the way to tundra, this is cold and dry. So one of the things that I typically have my students do is cover up these words and see if you can place each biome in its correct category. It's a good review for all of the terrestrial biomes. All right, so that's the land. Now let's go to the water. So by the end of this section, you should be able to describe the global distribution and principal aspects of aquatic biomes. So to get there, we're going to describe freshwater first. So we'll look at the freshwater, and there's two big categories there: free-flowing water and standing water. So the flowing water would be lakes and streams, or I'm sorry, streams and rivers, and then standing will be ponds and lakes. And then we'll go into the ocean, to the marine biomes, and that's going to be the ocean, the reefs, the marshlands, and the estuaries. So in terms of freshwater biomes, the first one is streams and rivers. And clearly this is a flowing water ecosystem. The water is moving, sometimes quite rapidly. And because of the varying types of rivers, you can have varying conditions and therefore varying organisms too, depending on whether it's upstream or downstream. How much canopy cover, how much shade the trees are giving on top of the stream or river, that might change the temperature. How deep it is, how fast it's flowing, the volume of water, the discharge of water, the turbidity, the cloudiness. So even salinity. So I live here in Jacksonville, Florida, and we have the St. Johns River, which flows north and then kicks right into the Atlantic Ocean here in Jacksonville. And we can notice an increase in salinity as it gets closer and closer to the ocean. So not all streams and rivers look the same. And in fact, topography is one of the big factors that'll do that. Now in this diagram, it's showing how the headwaters of these streams start in these high elevation with melting snow and ice. Now here in Florida, we don't have mountains, nor do we have snow or ice. A lot of our streams and rivers are fed by springs that come out of the ground. But either way, the headwaters are charged, they start to flow down. You start to get this meander, this wiggly back and forth before it discharges into the ocean. One of the words here is floodplain. Just remember the word floodplain is the area on either side of a river that will flood, either on a regular basis or a pretty occasional basis. But typically those floodplains are more fertile because the water floods up, deposits some of the nutrient-rich sediment, and then goes back. So we may have lots of agriculture in a floodplain. All right, so some human impacts. We talked heavily about this when we were talking about Unit 8 on aquatic pollution. I talked a lot about nuclear runoff, wastewater release, and agricultural runoff impacting water. So here we have pollution. Pollution is clearly a big impact on freshwater biomes. We could have nutrient pollution like eutrophication. We could have acid mine drainage, and we'll talk about that when we get to mining of coal. And you can also have sediment pollution from construction or erosion, just making the water more turbid and reducing photosynthesis. We could divert that water for human use, and we could build dams. So dams would clearly build up sediment upstream. Instead of letting the sediment flow downstream, it might build up here. And then clearly it's habitat fragmentation. These two habitats have now been fragmented. And like I said before, not all streams and rivers are the same. So on the left here is a pretty shallow, fast flowing river. And this is, again, the river I live near, St. Johns River, which is really slow moving and pretty big. Florida's flat, so we don't have a lot of elevation. So this river flows very slowly. It's pretty turbid from all the tannic acid of the decomposing leaves. So it looks very different. And differences in rivers and stream physical characteristics informs the kind of organisms that live there. We're going to take a look at a few-minute clip about Dr. Mary Power, and she is studying the relationship between the flow of a river and the organisms that live there.
I've always had a deep wonder and fascination about the natural world, and I'm especially intrigued with how species interact with each other and also with their environments. My scientific research focuses on rivers and the food webs they contain. Rivers are extremely dynamic habitats.
The only algae is diet squid.
They can change dramatically from season to season and from year to year with the amount of water that's flowing through them. Yet, rivers are also habitats with clear boundaries. With a little work, you can follow the key river food web members as they go through their daily lives and watch their numbers and their interactions change over time. One question that drives my work is, how does the amount of water flowing through a river affect its food web and the state of the river ecosystem as a whole? To answer this question, I've been studying the Eel River in Northern California year after year for the past 25 years.
So I just want to pause it here to focus your attention. Dr. Power is now going to talk about her experimental design, how she's setting up her experiment, her methods, how she's doing data collection. So not only focus on the flowing water ecosystem, but also her experimental design and her research.
That drains much less area.
You need a tape too, Victoria.
Our Eyes on the Eel survey is 10 Berkeley students and me, and we go out 3 times a summer.
We focus on 3 groups of organisms to get a picture of the river's food web: the fish, the aquatic invertebrates, and the algae. Now, algae are the base of the food web. They are at the lowest trophic level. The amount of algae and the type of algae both determine the health and diversity of the insects that eat it, and in turn, they determine the food supply for the fish that eat them. And then there are bigger fish that feed on the little fish. So all of this energy is flowing up the food web.
And then the size classes, you know the size?
We always start with the big fish. That's because the big fish in the pools spook most easily. So we need to count them first, or we'll scare them off when we're taking our other measurements.
When we snorkel the tributaries, one thing that is true for most tributaries in this part of the world is they're cold. So I put on a big dry suit, I zip it up. I have a dive slate on my arm. I typically know the type of organisms I'm going to run into in the tributaries, and I have different size classes which relate to different ages that we're interested in. You need to move very quietly, very slowly, and you don't want to be spooking fish. And it's such a neat experience to get to put your head underwater and join this aquatic world that you never get to be a part of otherwise. So I'm going to go snorkel up the pool, and we can start bugs and algae down here right now. So if you want to get going on that.
Once the larger fish in the pools have been counted, we count the juvenile fish from the shore. We take counts in 3-minute increments, carefully noting the species and size class of the fish.
2, 1, stop.
When we finish counting the fish, the team moves on to measuring the second component in the food web, the amount of algae that's there, or what we call the algal standing crop.
Nice catch.
The quickest way to get a picture of what the river habitat looks like at the moment is to throw a measuring tape across the stream, so it's a cross section.
A river is essentially a collection of pools connected by shallow riffles. We measure our cross sections in both pools and riffles.
And then you make a measurement from the water surface down on the stream bed at even intervals. The depth is 19. You can quantify the texture of the substrate. Is it cobbly, bouldery? Is it sand? Is it mud? What are the major algae that are growing there? That's enough information to draw a picture of what the algal standing crop is doing and how it's changing seasonally.
When we're done surveying the habitat and the algae, we move on to the aquatic invertebrates.
The riffle is where a lot of the bugs grow. We take an aquarium net and you sneak up on a rock and you pick up this rock skillfully and quickly, and then you invert it over a white plastic tray. You're looking at these tiny things, but they are so diverse, and some of them are so brave. They're little predators walking around trying to pinch the ruler that you're trying to measure them with, and we just get so fascinated.
Victoria, let's take a sample of this home because it might be something unusual.
When we are keeping track of the species, we can follow their densities from year to year.
When I started studying the eel 25 years ago, I had no idea of what controlled the river food web. What we have discovered is that water flow in the river over the entire year determines the state of the summer food web.
So her experiment really lent itself to understanding the relationship between the water flow and the organisms that live there. Really, really cool. Sounds like a great job. I'd love to be doing that. So let's now look at lakes and ponds. So these are standing water ecosystems. Now, an interesting aspect of the lakes and ponds is light and how low down light will penetrate. So over here on the shallower sides of the lake or the pond, we have the littoral zone. And this is where we have rooted vegetation. We have lots of productivity and biodiversity over on these shallower areas where light can penetrate all to the ground. And then the limnetic zone, the open part of the lake or pond. And in some lakes or ponds, not all, it may be deep enough that we have a profundal zone where light does not penetrate. And so therefore, the type of productivity and microorganisms and biodiversity up here in the light is going to be very different from without light down here. We may have slower rates of decomposition, maybe some hypoxic areas, but a very different community than we would find in the littoral zone. And whether or not you're getting it from standing water or free-flowing water, lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, that's where we get our drinking water. I know here in Florida, we draw ours from the Floridan aquifer, so we're drawing it from our groundwater. Some places draw drinking water from surface water, but whether it's surface or ground, it's all connected, and that's the important thing for us to remember. All right, let's get salty. So let's go to the ocean and the marine environment. So this is a nice poster to start with. It's from National Geographic, and it was made of the Gulf of Mexico right after the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So you can see down here at the bottom right is the broken pipe from Deepwater Horizon and this plume of crude petroleum, all of these hydrocarbons getting into the water. So that's not the story we're talking about telling here today, but I just wanted to point it out. So what you can also see is the really varied communities here. So up in this tidal area where the water is pretty shallow, the communities are very different than what you would find in the open part of the ocean, or even down into this benthic or bottom dwelling area. But again, it could get deep enough, or it does get deep enough in the ocean where light does not penetrate. So depth and light, nutrients, salinity, all of those things are really going to create a variety of different communities in the ocean. Again, open ocean communities are going to look different than tidal communities just because of these varying abiotic factors. And again, light is a big part of that. So just as a vocabulary reminder, benthic means bottom. So anything living on this bottom, whether it's shallow or deep, is called benthic. Pelagic is the open part of the ocean. And then we have this dark aphotic zone where we do not have light. So therefore photosynthesis is not going to happen, but we may have something like chemosynthesis that we would see in the hydrothermal vents, those deep, deep vents. Coral reefs are another marine biome. I talked a lot about this during Unit 9 under human impacts when I talked about coral bleaching. But overall, this is a picture of a coral reef. It's a benthic habitat, and it typically has to be in shallow waters where light can penetrate. Why? Because the coral polyps, the little tiny individual coral polyps, inside their tissues, they have a photosynthetic symbiont. They have an algae living in their tissues. That's what gives the coral reef such beautiful colors. It's because of all the algae living in their tissues. And so if they get the majority of their food from algae, they better be up somewhere where light can get them. So that's why you typically find corals in shallow habitats. And then they secrete this calcium carbonate that forms the whole reef structure. And then that just kind of builds up over time. But huge biodiversity, incredible species richness. But the biggest threats are coral bleaching and ocean acidification, two things clearly linked to climate change. Coral bleaching comes from when sea surface temperatures become too hot, the corals spit out their symbiotic algae. And if that goes on for too long, they starve to death because the algae was what was giving them a lot of their nutrients. But when they kick those out, they risk dying. And then the other thing is ocean acidification, which really affects the rate at which these organisms can build their shells out of calcium carbonate. So not only does ocean acidification affect coral reefs, but any organism that has a shell. So now let's go to a marshland. So a marshland is a coastal wetland. So remember, a wetland is an area where the soil is saturated with water at least part, if not all of the year. Marshes typically have brackish water, and the organisms that live here have to be adapted to rising and falling tides. One of the characteristics of a marshland is it's dominated by grasses. As opposed to a swamp, which is dominated by trees, a marshland is dominated by grasses. And they serve some really important roles for us. Talked about this when we talked about water back in units 8 and 9. But the benefits are mainly it helps to clean the water. So as the water flows down from inland out to the ocean, it almost acts like a speed bump. So it slows the water down and lets some of the sediment and pollutants filter out. And then all of these grasses are huge absorbers of nutrient. So any nutrient pollution that might be in the waters heading to the ocean, some of it is assimilated into the marsh grasses before it gets to the ocean. So it has some really clear human benefits. Then we've got estuaries. Estuaries are the nursery grounds of the ocean. So it's where flowing freshwater stream or river meets the ocean. The water is usually brackish. Brackish means not salt, not fresh, somewhere in between. Again, because there's tides up and down, it's going to affect the depth of the water and the salinity of the water. So organisms there have to have adapted to those changes. It's an insanely fertile ecosystem, huge NPP, huge species richness. And again, it's the nursery. It's characterized as a place where lots of larval stages of fish and shellfish and other organisms spend their time because it's a safe habitat for them to grow up in. Now, I'm not going to have you do this FRQ right now or for homework, but I just want you to make a note of it. 2003 FRQ question number 3 is a great review of estuaries and typical wetlands and some human impacts on those wetlands. So I highly recommend looking at 2003 question 3 and then looking at the scoring guidelines or the answer key. All right, the last little part of the ocean we need to talk about is all this algae, this ton of phytoplankton that is in the ocean. And it serves as the basis for the marine food web. As these phytoplankton drift and flow with the currents and the waves, they're eaten by zooplankton, which are eaten by smaller fish and bigger fish and bigger fish. So this is almost like the battery of the ocean. It's what's taking that energy from the sun and filtering it right down into the food web of the ocean. Does another huge benefit for us, gives us a lot of our oxygen. A huge chunk of the oxygen in our atmosphere comes from this phytoplankton in the ocean. And if it's making oxygen, it's sucking down carbon dioxide. And anything that does that in light of climate change is good. This is just a nice little graph or image of the world that shows the really high levels of chlorophyll in the oceans. So you can see the vast amount of productive algae that's out there. All right, so that was a fly through of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems or biomes. So let's just do a quick question check. So I'll give you 30 seconds for this question. So the answer here would be D, an increase in temperature and precipitation. This one says, which of the following best describes soil in many tropical rainforest? Does it lack horizons? Are they quickly depleted if the forest is removed? They are similar to soils in grasslands. They're well suited for growing a wide variety of crops. They are deep and well drained. And actually it is B. And we talked about that lack of build up nutrients within the A horizon of a tropical rainforest because the plants assimilated up so quickly. This one says the major biological source of dissolved oxygen in the ocean comes from, well, we just mentioned that, phytoplankton. All right, so this is a question I made up. See if you could determine which one of these biomes is best represented by this climatogram. I'll give you 30 seconds. All right, and the correct answer is tundra. Tundra, very low precipitation and cold temperatures. So where'd we go today? We did the terrestrial biomes, the aquatic biomes, and particularly with the terrestrial biomes, hopefully you started to see some patterns between them and among them, and the main things that distinguish one for the other in terms of latitude, in terms of temperature, in terms of precipitation, and then in terms of the organisms that are adapted to live there. So for this practice number one, concept explanation, remember, this is what the description of it says. It is important to make clear the distinction between memorizing details and demonstrating an integrated understanding of how a concept or process connects the overall function of the environment. Basically, that's saying, don't just memorize what a tundra is, be able to explain some of the environmental processes that are happening within the tundra. So here's an example. Explain the relationship between deciduous trees in a temperate seasonal forest and soil fertility. So take a few seconds and think what you might write there. So before we look at the answer, let's just look at this skill a little bit more. So explain concepts and processes. So the first part, the easiest part, is explaining the characteristics, explaining concepts. Then it gets into explaining the relationship between components, explaining how a process occurs, explain the relationship between structures and function. So these are some characteristics or some typical things that you might be asked to do on one of the FRQs on the exam. So in terms of the answer here, I wrote, deciduous trees in a temperate seasonal forest drop their leaves annually. Decomposers break down this leaf litter and add nutrients into the soil, thus increasing soil fertility. That's what I would have written. All right, so here's your homework. So your homework again is going to be an FRQ or part of an FRQ. And remember, I know I've said it a bajillion times, but I'll say it one more time. These task verbs matter. Know the difference between identify, describe, explain, yada, yada, yada. So here's the question I would like you to do. This is called worm invasion. So I'm going to read this first part to you. And then for homework tonight, you're going to do A, B, and D. So it says, a researcher studying the ecology of deciduous forest outside of Fremont has made an alarming discovery. So automatically you see the word deciduous. So you know this is probably a temperate seasonal forest. While taking an inventory of the species present on the forest floor, Professor Tate discovered many earthworms of an Asian species not previously known to live in this area. The Asian worms, unlike native worms, have voracious appetites. The forest floor is home to a myriad of species that live in the leaf litter, which is composed of several years' accumulation of slowly decomposing leaves. Dr. Tate explained that the leaf litter is critical to the survival of local species of forest plants. He has found the Asian worms, unlike the indigenous cousins, consume the entire layer of leaf litter in a single season. He said, quote, this sets the stage for the takeover by invasive exotics such as Japanese stiltgrass. Dr. Tate and other scientists are exploring strategies to control this Asian worm. So what I'd like for you to do for homework tonight is to complete A, B, and D, and Ms. Fassler will go over the answers with you next time. And hopefully you can draw a little bit of what we talked about with biomes today. Again, if you have connectivity issues or know anyone who does, please reach out to this URL because connectivity and internet access at this point is not only critical for what we're doing today, but it's going to be critical for you actually taking the exam in May. So thank you again. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Bye, apes.